documenting that people know that these documents are all part of the. Yeah.
Oh, well, that's not like it was last year. I mean, or the last time I was.
Yeah.
It's a little weird.
Coaches. I heard you guys don't have hoops this year.
They have them on Saturdays, so. And then. So we're on good? Hold on to it.
Big dandelion. Yeah.
You say we're good, Christina? I'm gonna open the meeting.
Oh, did I know that?
Yeah. All right, then I'll open the meeting. So. First thing we have is to approve the minutes from our past meeting. Did everyone get a chance to look at those? Yes. Anyone see any corrections or adjustments to be made? No. Motion to approve as written? All right. All right. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, and those are the minutes. And our next item is the hearing from Flowers by Steve. I will waive the formal reading of the application as it was published in the Sentinel. So I'm not sure who all is here for them and who is here just public to visit. You're welcome to come up and grab seats. For the rest of you and for everyone's listening, this is a interpretation of the code. So we will hear from the applicant. We will give the public a chance to comment. We may make a decision tonight. It may be the next meeting when the decision is actually published. That depends on how things play out.
I just need y'all to introduce yourself and the rest too, please.
My name is Daniel Brennan. I'm from the law firm Davidson Fink, and I'm here on behalf of the applicant.
I'm Steve Goodemote over at 977 Mouseboro Road.
And I'm Jenny Goodemo, 977 Mouseboro Road. Legal address. 5240 Overlook Lane.
Yeah, mine would be the same. Katrina, did you get the notarized
I did not.
affidavit?
How was it sent?
I thought it was in the stack there, was it not?
Oh, well, it was, no, the top was actually the documents that you emailed me today. Unless David has, he was my top one. So, no.
Okay, it might still be in the car.
Yeah, I need that
Grab it.
before, actually for determination, I'm gonna do that.
Okay. So like after we're done speaking, I can run and grab it.
Yep.
No problem.
So before we get into this, everyone's familiar with the application?
Yes.
Good. Then you would give us a summary and then I'm sure we'll have questions.
Great. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you for your time tonight. We're here, as the chairman mentioned, for an appeal of an interpretation that was made by the town of Mendon code enforcement officer. And we have a very specific question for you tonight, which is whether or not the property at 977 Miles Square Road was a legal use at the time that the code enforcement officer's opinion or interpretation was issued, and that was on August 1st, 2022. The relevance of that is of course that the town of Mendon code provides that a legally existing non-conforming use is allowed to continue as long as it's continuously used for that non-conforming use. And so if you decide tonight that this property was being used for a legal purpose in August of last year, the use will be allowed to continue on. I'm sure you're familiar with the background, which is that the town board adopted a moratorium on short-term stays. Just for simplicity, I'm going to refer to short-term stays as Airbnbs. It's a little bit easier, kind of rolls off my tongue easier.
When was the moratorium thing?
Moratorium was adopted by local law number 2 in 2022 and was filed with the Department of State. It looks like on August 30th of 2020.
Was the home being rented for that point?
Yes, it was. So I'll let Stephen get into the details a little bit more, but just as a brief summary, it was purchased in December of 2021 for the sole purpose of renting as an Airbnb. And the applicant invested a significant amount of money in capital improvements in the property. And that investment was based on their understanding and their review of the code, that the code did not prohibit or prevent or circumscribe Airbnbs in any way, short-term rentals in any way. In fact, if you look at the code as it existed prior to the adoption of the moratorium, there's nothing in the code related to the term of a rental whatsoever. There's nothing in the code that prohibited non-owner occupied housing as a use of land or as a use of property. And there's nothing that limited how long a non-owner occupied property could be leased for, whether that would be an annual lease, a month-to-month lease, or a nightly or multi-nightly occupancy like this property is being used for.
But there is a section that regulates tourist homes and bed and breakfasts.
That's correct. That's correct. This property was not a tourist home, wasn't a bed and breakfast.
What's a tourist home?
Bed and breakfast is defined under the code. And essentially the difference between this and a tourist home is a tourist home allows multiple different groups of guests to stay at the same property. And so if you look at other provisions of the code, and not just the town amended code, but almost every zoning code that I'm aware of, distinguishes between single family homes and multi-family dwellings, where you have either a single family or what the courts have, and this code defines as a group of people that are essentially functioning as a single family, living in one dwelling unit, right? As opposed to a property that has multiple families living in the same building or on the same property in multiple different units. That's essentially what, in our positions, that's essentially what the tourist homes are defining as a use of land. Is a place where multiple groups of people can come in for a short-term stay. So that was a regulated land use prior to August of 2022. One of the reasons, I know it's a bit confusing, our initial application contains an application to the planning board for a special use permit to allow it as a tourist home. We essentially put in that application as a stopgap measure. I was retained sort of after this notice of violation on August 1st. So we didn't have a whole lot of time. We needed to get this application in before my client would potentially be liable for significant fines. So we put in the application for a special use permit. I'm not going to say it was at the direction of the town, but it was based on an interpretation of the code that it could potentially be found to be a special use permit, but our position always was that this was a legally existing single family home. It was a single family dwelling that was allowed in the RA5 or R5 single family district when it was purchased in December of 2021, and it was used for that purpose ever since, because the only guests that have ever stayed at the property have been single families or groups of people that function as a single family. And the reason we know that is Stephen will tell you that's who he's rented to, and that's the only groups, the only guests that he's rented to. But also the layout of the home itself is a single family dwelling. The courts have actually found that you can't regulate whether non-blood related people, how many non-blood related people can occupy a single family home at the same time. What they look at is whether this group of non-related blood related people functions as a single family, and that's the main test, is actually whether they use the same kitchen, right, to prepare their meals, and whether they have locks on their doors. The town of Mendon code accurately reflects that legal standard in New York State, and defines single family homes essentially and as a dwelling. Single family is defined as an attached residential dwelling unit occupied exclusively by one or more persons living as a single housekeeping unit.
What's the site on that?
And so that's code section 5-4. So that's the definition section, I believe. So it would be within that. within that section. And, you know, I would note that there's nothing in that definition, single family dwelling, that talks about the length of how long someone can stay. Or the term that the property can be leased for, or how many guests can be allowed in the home. And so our position is that our position back in December 2021 was that this was a legal use of the property. And then the moratorium was adopted. And so if there was any question back in December 2021, whether this property was in fact a single family use, or whether the town of Mendon regulated Airbnbs, that question was resolved by the town board when they adopted this local law. There's actually legislative findings in the local law that was adopted by the town board, and I'm going to read a short excerpt for you. This is in section 2, paragraph 2. It's about halfway down. As such, the town board finds that unregulated short-term vacation rentals or short-term rental occupancies as defined in this local law may be incompatible with residential neighborhoods and zoning districts, and that such uses must be carefully regulated and monitored. And I won't go on.
That doesn't mean they weren't regulated before.
Well, in fact, it states that they were unregulated short-term vacation rentals.
This doesn't say unregulated rentals are a problem. It doesn't say our code does not regulate rentals.
It doesn't, I would agree, it doesn't say that specifically, but the purpose of this moratorium was to effectively prohibit short-term stays, at least during the period of the moratorium. And so that of course implies that they were not prohibited prior to the adoption of the moratorium. If short-term stays were allowed in the town of Mendon prior to August 2022, then there was no need to adopt this moratorium.
The need is because they want to change the regulations.
I understand that. I would agree, is that the town board effectively changed the regulations as of August 2022. And we would agree that this use could not be established today. All right, it could not be established on August 31st of 2022. But it could be established prior to that, which is why the town board adopted this moratorium. The other portion I want to read is from section 3, paragraph 3, and this sort of goes to the fact that the town board made a finding that short-term stays were allowed unless reasonable measures are taken for an interim period. And I won't read all of it. Further convergence of residential properties and establishment of new short-term rental uses may occur within the town, and then it goes on. So what this implies is that the town board made a legislative finding that if this moratorium was not adopted, new short-term rentals would be allowed. It doesn't say that they were preventing all short-term rentals. It just says that they were preventing new short-term rentals. This is not a new short-term rental as of August 2022. This was an existing short-term rental as of August 2022. And our position is that there's a legislative finding as to that. I'll try and speed up here because I know I'm taking up a lot of your time. I'm going to skip to section 6, paragraph 1. And this is just to reinforce sort of the statement I made earlier. This is from about halfway through that first sentence where it says, no short-term rental occupancy use shall be established or expanded within any zoning district within the town of Mendon. So the purpose of the moratorium was to prevent the establishment of a short-term stay rental and to prevent the expansion of a short-term stay rental. This property was not established as a short-term stay rental after the moratorium was adopted, and it certainly wasn't expanded. It's been occupied and used consistently since it was purchased in December of 2021. The last point that I want to make here is about the determination that we're appealing. That's relatively important. And so this is the notice of potential zoning violation. And I think that there's actually more evidence within this determination that requires you to overturn it. I'm looking at the third paragraph in Mr. Gates' letter. It says, town of Mendon zoning laws simply do not support short-term rentals special event venues or other not-for-profit entities otherwise allowed in the business zoning district. This finding was made on August 1st, 2022, approximately 1 month before the moratorium was adopted. We're seeking to appeal this determination. Mr. Gates doesn't provide any reasons why, any basis to say that short-term rentals were prohibited by the code. In fact, the term short-term rental is not in the code. There's no definition of short-term rental in the code as of August 1, 2022. And there's no discussion of the term of rentals in August 2022 under the code. Nobody would argue that in August 2022, my client couldn't have rented out this property as a.
Would you agree that if the property is covered under a tourist home is found to encompass an Airbnb rental of a single family home, would you still agree with what you just said? Would that be cause for this zoning violation?
Well, we don't agree that it was.
I understand that. I'm not asking you to agree to that. I'm saying if that were true, would that be a basis for this zoning violation?
Well, to be fair, I would actually still argue that this actual determination that the town of Mendon zoning laws do not support short-term rentals is in fact not true. Because if there's a specially permitted use in this district, then the town of Mendon zoning laws do support short-term rentals. But again, it's just hypothetical. I think that there's no basis. There's no basis to say that their short-term rentals were allowed.
Well, again, the basis would be 260.13b says any use not specifically permitted is prohibited. 260.52 defines tourist homes, and in a different part it says tourist homes are not a permitted use in an RA5 district. So that's how we get there. It's not a mystery.
It's a single family, right? And the distinction between a tourist home and a single family home is that a tourist home can be used by multiple families or multiple groups that are essentially functioning as separate families. Whereas this property has never been used that way and will not be used that way. And one final thing that I'll add is that we're only asking for a very limited ruling here. And we certainly, this board has the ability to impose reasonable conditions on an approval of our request to overturn this decision. And we certainly would not object to any reasonable ongoing compliance mechanism that this board deems appropriate to ensure that it is only rented out to single families. You know, I don't want to get into too much into the policy considerations here because I don't think they're particularly germane, but we can appreciate and understand that the town wants to prevent large unrelated groups of people particularly from throwing parties that will become a nuisance and a problem for the neighborhood. And we are committed to making sure that that does not happen. And we will not object to any reasonable conditions that ensure compliance with the town code, ensure compliance that we're only renting out to families and to one family at a time. And so I could propose conditions that you can include, or if you vote to include them with your approval, we certainly wouldn't object and we will comply. Because that is our intention, is to use the property as a single family dwelling.
So a little bit of history on 260.52. It was initially enacted back in the 30s, and it was to prevent transient homing because this is an agricultural community. You know, so it was meant to keep people from staying 2 months while they're working, and then the house is vacant and all dilapidated, and maybe the group would call it a cave in and do so on and so forth. And it's still community activism. And that's one of those things that gets lost in a lot of this is that it's transient homing, you know, and it's not so much that it's a single family or it's multiple families, but the way that the language was initially intended was to prevent it altogether and to make sure that if you were going to rent or lease, that it was going to be for extended durations.
Sure, I can appreciate that, and I'm not up to speed on the history of that, but I will say that as a specially permitted use, the vacation homes are essentially a legislative finding that vacation homes are appropriate in this district, but simply the special use permit must be obtained in order to ensure that the particular proposed use is appropriate. Right, they're saying in general, when it's especially permitted use, that it is allowed and that it is appropriate in the zoning district. Again, we don't think that there's any basis to call us a tourist home. We were and are a single family home. Which is exactly why the town board acted, and I'm not arguing that the town board didn't take appropriate action in adopting this moratorium. We take no position on that. I understand that this is an important consideration, but it cannot be retroactive. The town code does not allow for the retroactive application of land use restrictions, nor does New York state law.
But your position is that a tourist home is something different than a single family home rented out to one single group of people.
Absolutely, absolutely, that's our position.
You know, I'd also like to say about, you know, letting the home go vacant, you know, become dilapidated and all that. You know, we purchased it, it was in good shape, but we put almost $100,000 into it, improving it, making it look much nicer. And we have a really high standard for what we're trying to accomplish here. You know, we're trying to make a very nice place for people to stay and come visit. I mean, our contractor's here, he can tell you, you know, we're really not sparing anything, trying to make this place safe, nice, functional.
Our goal is to have you as a member of this community.
Sure.
Like that's
Yeah.
what the idea behind it is.
Yes, and we've been doing that. I mean, you can see the welcome book, right? Like we've got all kinds of local recommendations and, you know, we like Mendon. We come here with our kids, you know, Mendon Ponds Park is great. We recommend it to the people who come and stay with us, right? And that's the thing too, is that, you know, we've had 30 some different stays in the last year and a half since we've been open. And 18 at least have specifically mentioned that they're coming to visit family, they're coming to visit for funerals, birthdays, like that sort of thing. And I think that we're aligned here in that we don't want parties just as much, probably more than the neighbors in the, right? Because it's a nuisance, right? It's a nuisance for the neighbors, they're loud and all that, right? But it's a lot of money for us if they damage the property. So we have a lot of things in place. We have cameras at every door. We make sure that the people who, you know, the number of guests that have registered are the number of people that are there. We make sure that there aren't more people coming. We make sure there aren't people coming extra, you know, extra friends or whatever coming in. We make sure that there aren't people local that rent it, right? For like one night. We have a 2-night minimum, so you can't just rent it for one night. All that is just to basically ensure that there are no parties there. And our direct next door neighbor is here as well. And I mean, he can tell you that, John, that it's been very quiet, right?
I have not had a single noise complaint from your house.
Your name?
John Zotto 979. From that house, there had been no complaint. The fireworks shows across the street from the much more expensive home have been significantly more disruptive than anything involving short-term rental next to my property. Thank you.
On the contract.
Now, don't, there's a time public hearing, you directly asked him to offer information for the case, so I'm
On the
gonna
second.
go. Yes, when we get to that step, anything you guys want to say? So. Before that, does anyone have any other questions or?
one of the questions was if you had any direct neighbor support of that. Second one, I was gonna ask, what was your closing date on the property of 21?
December 3rd, I believe it was December 3rd. It was definitely early December.
And then I guess the only other one I had was, you talked about checking up and making sure others aren't part of like additional. How are you enforcing that? How do you know that they're outside of just viewing a few cameras? Are you visiting? Are you checking in? Are you stopping in?
No, of course not. I think that would, you know, violate the privacy of renting it, right? But I mean, we check the cameras when they come in and we check periodically, make sure there aren't more cars there. And, you know, if we do have a complaint, we can check and make sure and see, you know, who came in and all that. And then Airbnb has repercussions if people violate that, right? Everyone that registers on the site that is allowed to rent at our place has to have a driver's license on file with Airbnb, so they will be held accountable for, you know, the rules that they violate.
Prior to launching the Airbnb, we did send mail to our neighbors in the surrounding area, because we wanted them to be able to contact us and vice versa. if they saw anything that was, damage to the property or a party was forming at the house. They had our contact information to be able to call us and let us know. So we wanted to have that transparency right off the bat. We got to meet John for the first time. We met, I think, Tom across the street. They came up with some suggestions regarding, one was a motion detection light. Another one was putting a sign at the foot of the driveway so that people are aware of pulling out, because it is a busy street, being careful before they pull out. So we take those suggestions because we want to be good neighbors. We just take it very seriously. I know what we would expect living in a neighborhood, and we would treat people the same way.
Just like to add one final comment before, and I'm obviously happy to take more questions, but what we're asking for tonight is a very, very narrow ruling regarding Mr. Gates' interpretation. We don't think that this is generally applicable at all. We're asking you to look at this property specifically, look at our papers specifically, our papers which were filed with the clerk prior to the adoption of the moratorium. And so a decision from you tonight overturning this specific interpretation is not generally applicable to any other Airbnbs. It does not undermine the town board's authority to regulate Airbnbs in the town. It's just specifically allowing this property to continue. And so I don't think that you need to look at the sort of ramifications for the rest of the town. You're only looking at how this decision was made and how the town code is being applied to this specific property and the specific facts of this case, which are unique.
Wouldn't it affect any similarly situated property that was being rented to groups of people who could be characterized as single family before the moratorium was put in effect?
It would have to be continuous, right? They would have to, that property owner would have to establish that it was continuous and that it never ceased, that there was no other intervening type of use in between when it was established and when the moratorium was adopted. I would also argue that it's possible that they would have to get their appeal and their decision in prior to the adoption of the moratorium. And so unless there was someone else that has an appeal, a request for an interpretation and an appeal prior to the adoption of the moratorium, I think you could argue that the moratorium would apply at that point because it hadn't been legally established.
When you say other type of use, you mean renting it to a group of people who could not be characterized as a single family?
Correct.
What sort of individuals that rent houses through Airbnb could be characterized in that way?
Well, if you have an Airbnb that's, I actually rent Airbnbs all the time, and a lot of them actually will rent the rooms individually. It's a lot cheaper if you have a single person. You can rent a single room, or sometimes you can rent part of the house. And a lot of Airbnbs operate that way. My client's property does not operate that way. Anyone that uses it, or I would argue at any point has used it that way, they've lost their non-conforming status potentially. And again, I think if it wasn't established prior to the moratorium, then it absolutely is not allowed to continue. So what we're asking for is a very narrow, specific ruling that we believe will only affect our property.
So if I could try to rephrase what you said, kind of boil it down, you would say that it's a single family use and therefore it's not a tourist home. And you've been in effect before the moratorium, and since the moratorium says that unregulated, as you say, this doesn't apply to you, or the moratorium doesn't.
That's absolutely right.
All right, just wanted to make sure I understood what you were saying.
Thank you.
Question. Did your clients at any time prior to the letter from Corey Gates, did they at any time obtain any type of interpretation or opinion or confirmation from the town about the validity or legality of their use?
They did not. If this property has always been a single family home, or at least it was prior to my client purchasing it, There's nothing in the code that would require any type of interpretation or permit in order to continue a single family use. And so essentially, they did their due diligence, say, look, what do we need in order to get this approved? And the code said nothing. So that's why there were no approvals or permits or interpretations to obtain prior to establishing this use. Which is why, you know, it's pretty clear under the code, a non-conforming use is allowed to continue, but it has to be previously legally established. Here, we were legally established because nothing was required. There was no certificate of zoning compliance was required, no building permits, nothing. In fact, you probably obtained building permits for the HVAC work, or anything required for it?
No, I don't think so.
So there was nothing required, so it was legally established by essentially doing something.
Wouldn't it have been prudent in hindsight for your clients to have checked with the code enforcement officer at any time prior to August of 22?
Probably. I mean, it was our first one, right? We looked through the code. We didn't see anything, so,
To the realtors.
yeah.
Spoke to the selling our realtor and the seller's realtor.
Yeah.
To see if there was anything that we should be aware
I
of.
mean, I sent this to our realtor and he was floored by it. I mean, he said that if anything like this, he said he would have known about it in an instant. I mean, he knew what we were looking for and pointed us in the, I mean, we trusted him. I honestly just didn't realize I had to hire a lawyer to go through the code to make sure that what we wanted it to do was explicitly, I mean, we looked through it.
To be fair, if I had been retained in December of 2021, I would have advised them that there was nothing required to establish this use because the code didn't say that there was. In fact, there's an important principle of zoning law, which is that land use regulations, to the extent there's any ambiguity, those ambiguities must be construed in favor of the property owner. And so unless the code clearly prohibits this use, it cannot be prohibited retroactively. There's nothing in the Mendon Town Code that provides for advisory opinions, in my understanding. So I'm not sure what we could have done to legalize this type of use other than what was done, which was to establish it and continue it after the property was purchased. When people buy a single family home in the town of Mendon, they don't go to the zoning office to ask if it's legal. They continue to use it as a single family home. That's what we did.
No, but I had a stockade fence that was taller than 6 foot, and I asked the code enforcement officer about it because it was kind of one of those things I wanted to make sure that when I was closing on it, everything that was on the property was legal.
Yeah.
And that was one of those things that like I even picked up on that like you can't have a fence taller than 4 foot, you can't have a stockade fence, period. So it was like, oh, okay, here's double innuendo, and that was before I did anything,
I agree, and to the extent the code prohibits or circumscribes, regulates something like fences, you're absolutely diligent to make sure that whatever you're buying is legal, that there was a permit for it or a variance, whatever was required. But here, this type of use was not prohibited or circumscribed by the code. So there was nothing to check with the code enforcement officer.
Right. And then the use is though commercial, now, correct? You're using it as a full rental. You guys don't live there.
I'm not sure what you mean by commercial, I guess is.
It's being used for just income, correct?
Oh, it's being rented out on Airbnb. I mean, you could probably characterize it that way, but under the code, it's being used as a single family use. So the code doesn't differentiate between, for instance, non-owner occupied housing. You are allowed under the town of Mendon code to own a single family property and rent it for a 1-year term to a single family. I understand that happens all the time. I would argue the town of Mendon probably could not regulate away rental of properties because that would impinge on people's property rights. So I'm not arguing that the town can't regulate short-term stays. They can. They just can't regulate them retroactively.
But we're kind of ignoring the fact that they did 260-52. I mean, if you read the code, you read the code, but if you read the code, you saw 260-52 talks about tourist homes and bed and breakfast establishments. And the first criteria it talks about is the number of lodging rooms for hire. Somebody who's buying a house to rent it out that should, in my view, put you on notice that this possibly applies to your planned use of the property. And if you had been their attorney at the time and you really had said to them, oh no, everything's fine, then I would question whether there would be a malpractice suit in the future.
Well, you know, the fact that the town board adopted this moratorium tells me, and I think a court would agree, that short-term stays were not regulated prior to the moratorium. I mean, think the Airbnb is a fairly new concept. And we wouldn't say that, you know, 10 or 15 years ago, the town of Mendon intended to regulate Airbnbs before Airbnbs became popular and certainly before they even existed. Right? People have been inviting guests into their home for as long as people have had homes.
The commerce part of it is the part that is trying to be regulated.
The single family use does not distinguish between for-profit or not-for-profit, owner-occupied or rental.
But the tourist home part does, lodging rooms for hire.
Right? Our rooms are not for hire. It's only the single family home that is for guests' use. It's not the rooms, the individual rooms. That's the distinction.
If I could back up to the question he asked, you're not living there, it's always being rented out, your actual residence is elsewhere. Well, I thought, just wanted to be sure. You know what, thank you. Anybody else have some questions? All right, anything else you want to say?
Thank you very much for your time and consideration.
Yeah.
We appreciate it.
Thank you.
I think they're showing up.
So at this point, I will point out that we received a number of emails and letters from various people that believe we all have a copy of both that Katrina forwarded to us and a hard copy in front of us. And with that having been noted, is there anyone in the public that would like to comment on this topic? You can give your, yeah. I think I opened the public hearing for stuff, but if not, yes, public hearings is open.
Have them identify their name.
Yeah.
3 minutes.
There.
Whatever works for you.
So I'm the contractor.
You could give your name and.
Yeah. Yep. My name is Taylor Nichols. I live at 366 State Route 245.
Okay. Sprinkler vehicles.
Taylor,
Yep. 36.
366 State Route 245,
And what town is that?
Rushville, New York. I've known Steve and Jenny for about 2 years. I've done work in multiple houses that they own, put in the personal home and other Airbnbs. They don't cut corners. They invest wisely, and to be honest, I think they're really good people. I think that I think that what they're doing as a single family home truly is like, yeah, they're renting that out, but it is a single family. I personally go up and work on the home if there's any issues that it needs while they're staying there. I've worked in his personal house that I work for them. They're stand-up people, and I mean, to be honest, I think you guys have your mind made up, and I hope that you consider working with them on this.
Thank you, Taylor.
Thank you.
I was one of the neighbors, I think that I didn't get anything, any information from that house. They went right to- But
Can you come to the podium, please, so we can all hear you better? Sorry.
the zoning that London had put forth is to keep the character of the area. And we are old. Because they were the same pretty much when I moved in 30 years ago. And that's how London is able to keep the character. It's not Pittsburgh, it's not Henrietta, it's not Victor, it's unique. It's London. And as Justin pointed out, we want people to move in and live there and like the place and enjoy the place. It's a beautiful rural, historic bucolic setting, and we're very lucky that Renaissance Park is in the district. And we'd like to keep it that way. And these are written before all these new ideas came about, Airbnb, BRD or whatever. So it doesn't actually state that you can't do this, you can't do that. It caught us by surprise. So yes, so quickly came up with rules to try to prevent that from happening. We don't want more and more commercial business moving. We wanted to keep our residences, our residential area, residential. We don't want businesses in a non-business area. Redmond has been doing that, and they did a very good job in keeping its character. And we're trying to keep our character. And I got surprised, I think all the boys got surprised because these are all very old, yes. It's been around since we moved here, and we moved here because we like Redmond. We like it for its character, for its special rural setting. It's a suburb, but it's not like any of the other suburbs around here. It's unique, specific suburb. So if you like one of the other suburbs, then you can move there. If you want to make money, have businesses, then you can move to one of the other things that would be more beneficial. So it's written as a one single family dwelling on lot. That is to keep business out of it, not to keep Airbnb, because there was nobody thought about Airbnb before the rules were written. So as a resident in the community, I would like the board to keep the character and keep business out of residential area.
Thank you. Anyone else like to comment? Yeah,
Hi, so my name is Carrie Magnan. CARRIE MAGNAN. And I've known Stephen Jetty for about
Address.
6335 East Hollow Road in Canada.
Thank you.
I first of all, I want to thank you for being here. And thank you for allowing us to present thoughts on this case. I've known Steve and Jenny for about 10 years, and I've seen them go through this process with their Airbnb. And as you know, Flowers by Steve operates an Airbnb in Mendon. Steve and Jenny have worked tirelessly to make the house a warm and inviting space. Their hard work has made the home a respite for travelers looking to unwind, relax, and enjoy all the Finger Lakes in this region has to offer. And I believe they deserve to be allowed to continue operating. And the reason for this is simple. Flowers by Steve was already in operation before the moratorium was put in place, and they have been operating in good faith ever since. To shut them down now would not only be unfair, but it would also send a bad message to other small business owners who are trying to make a living in this area. Flowers by Steve and this Airbnb has been an asset to the community. The Airbnb has brought in visitors from all over the country and the world who have spent money here in this community, going to restaurants, to shops, to other businesses. And they have been great ambassadors for this area, offering valuable insight to the people who are visiting here for the first time and offering recommendations for things to see and do while here and where to spend money in this community. I understand that there are concerns about short-term rentals and their impact on neighborhoods, but we can't punish small business owners like Steve and Jenny and the Flowers by Steve team who have been doing everything right. Instead, we should be focusing on finding a way to regulate short-term rentals in a way that is fair and equitable to everyone. In conclusion, I ask that you view Flowers by Steve with an open mind, recognizing the hard work Steve, Jenny, and the Flowers by Steve team have put into their Airbnb and allow them to continue operating and be grandfathered in under the old rules. Thank you for your time.
anyone else? Yeah, I saw the other hand. You raised the same line.
Not bad. John Rowe, 979, I'll swear.
979.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I
live right next to the Airbnb. I am the only other home on our shared private driveway. I own that driveway. They have an easement on my driveway to drive into their home. We had our first son in late September 2021. And so when this Airbnb showed up, we were nervous. I feel like my specific circumstances are very applicable in this general case. We were worried about a problem that has yet to present itself. There has not been a single noise complaint. There has not been a single disturbance to me personally living on that driveway. The only driveway people can drive down wrong. You drove down my driveway incorrectly before this Airbnb existed. The problem we're trying to solve here doesn't exist, especially in this single case, because I'm the one who would be most affected by this problem. Me, my 19-month-old son, and my wife would clearly be the most affected people by this specific case. We have no complaints at all. I barely know them. I'm here because there seems to be no reason for them to have this problem in the first place. That's all I have to say.
Thank you. I saw a hand in the back up.
494.
Come a little closer, can't quite hear you.
What's your first name, Mr. Rosenberg?
Barry.
We heard music coming from that area. I don't know who it's coming from specifically, but there's nothing like music that destroy my enjoyment of my property. Because they blast it out of the speakers. We have no way of knowing who's doing it, so I'm not blaming them. But it's totally inappropriate. We have no way of calling anything. Did not get notice of an Airbnb, so we don't know who to call for the problem other than the sheriff. I'm not sure that I'm very happy. Probably 10 minutes. The other thing is, I don't see why people think that it's okay to take a residential neighborhood and try to make money. It's a residential neighborhood. I wanted to open a copper smelting plant and say, oh yeah, I need money. So that wouldn't be allowed. No commercial property and no commercial use. Ridiculous. Thank you.
Thank you, Barry.
Thank you. Anyone else? Anyone online?
I received an email that I'll read if that's okay. Just because I can't multitask on here. This is from Roberta Rick. She lives at 987. I believe I may have it backwards, 977. Says, please let the zoning board know. She just had someone come to her door, so just now. Looking for his friend at 977 Milesville Road. A bunch of his friends are renting it. The numbers, I'm sorry, are a little transposed in this. So her home, people came from Goodmode's property to her home looking for his friends who are now renting the home here.
This is the same Roberta who wrote the letter.
Correct.
Okay.
Anything else online at the moment?
Not at the moment.
I wanted to make one more comment, if I may. Just a point that I probably should have made earlier. There was some discussion about the tourist homes and definition of tourist home under the code and whether this was especially permitted use and therefore would not be a permitted use. I'd just like to draw your attention to section 260.52, which are the regulations for tourist homes. It specifically says that the subject premises shall be owner occupied. So in order to be a tourist home, you have to be owner occupied. And that matters because if it's owner occupied, there's necessarily going to be multiple families or multiple groups of people functioning as separate families, occupying the home at the same time. If it's owner occupied and you have guests coming to stay with you, it's similar to a multi-family use. That is not what's going on at the property, right? Mr. Goodmote, none of the principals of the LLC, business entity that owns the property, live there. They're never there at the same time as any of the single families that are staying there. That's the difference between this and what is defined as a tourist home and especially permitted use under the code. Thank you.
Thank you. And anyone else? Okay.
There was reference to. Excuse me, Dan. Did your client mention an affidavit that was intended to be submitted as part of the record.
I need that.
Do we have that?
I do not have it.
Would you mind getting that if you have that?
Is it notarized and signed? Okay, good, because I don't, I'm not a notary and we can't, so
And so we would need that before we can make a determination, right?
my understanding, yes.
So we
Well,
need to
we
keep
need that.
talking, even though it's not here at the moment while he runs out and gets it, or should we just give him a few minutes?
Just give them a minute.
Fair enough.
You know, if there's no further witnesses, you can close this portion and talk about your deliberate or decide how you want to handle this procedurally. In terms of, you know, in terms of tonight, if it's still a different night, it's up to you. There's been a lot that's been discussed.
There has been.
So you're free to continue to start your deliberations tonight if you want, or you can. Think and we can be at a later date. Discuss it then after having a chance to consider what's been submitted.
So does anyone see a reason not to close the public hearing? Do you want more information in any way, or should we call it public hearing?
Speak now.
Well, we've asked them for comments.
All right.
If there's not,
So we would close it pending the submission of this affidavit.
presumably that will be in here for the next couple minutes, yes. All right. Then we'll give him a couple minutes to come back up here to formally take that action. With that, I think, so I was talking to David and he did put together a draft, which I think we would need to change enough that, like he said, we probably want to hold off till next meeting. If any of you think we can go with that as is, I'll go with the majority there. But I think it would be good for us to discuss what we intend in a general sense.
My suggestion especially is that, given the fact that we're now receiving additional documentation, and none of us have seen until about this moment, will give us an opportunity to consider that.
So we have the affidavit now. But this goes in the file, Katrina? Well, we need that. By all means, look at it. Standard formalities, yeah.
That's verified. The code enforcement did verify.
So it's more technicality than anything before. Yeah. So with that, motion to close the public hearing? Move to close the public hearing. And second, all those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, and that is the public hearing. You're all welcome to hang out and listen to us discuss. So. I'll go first, I guess. So the listening to his discussion or arguments. It seems like the core point here is what is tourist home? How is that defined? I would think if there was not section 260-52 that talks about them. That the single family or how was it phrased? Or groups functioning in a single family. I would seem like that was a plausible interpretation. But we do have 260-52 with tourist homes, and we have had the home moratoriums in effect, which in my mind says that the town board saw an issue and wanted to address it before it got worse, as opposed to there was no issue, it was unregulated. Does anyone have any other thoughts on that?
I agree with you that the question is, does definition of tourist home encompass property used to rent on Airbnb? It's an interesting argument that renting an Airbnb to groups of people who could be fairly characterized as a single family can thus be described as a single family use. That is an interesting argument in a good way. But I am not convinced at this point. I'm not convinced that this does not fall within the definition of tourist home. And that doesn't, a lot of the argument or a lot of the comments from the public tonight had to do with the quality of the workmanship and the quality of the management and also the noise. And none of that has really anything to do with what we're doing tonight. I am my personal opinions about whether there should be and Airbnb use allowed at your property are not really an issue. Because it could be, and appears to be, a very well done property in a place that doesn't bother its neighbor, constructed by someone who knows what they're doing, managed by people who know what they're doing. And yet the question is whether the code permitted it at the time that it started. That's the only question. And I personally can't get there.
Like you say, I think it's a very interesting view of it. And I actually was glad that we got that discussion, because reading the paperwork beforehand, it's like I wasn't seeing that, but no, that was a good, different interpretation, and I would agree that the definitions need some work, which is why we've got a moratorium currently in play. So.
When was the last time the code was adopted and revised? It was 2018 or 19?
I think there were a couple of small.
And was totally. Not revised, but it was totally approved, probably 90, yes, that's a guess on my part.
A lot of little things.
Yeah,
This is why-
That was the one after the.
Once in a while, you gotta go to town vote and
Yeah,
make so many amendments to it, you gotta.
it was that team that came in and came up with a comprehensive plan and started, yeah,
Different.
well, that, not the one 2 years ago, yeah. Independent reviews.
I believe that this particular section of the code underwent some changes also in December of 21.
So I understand that was true to the owner occupied portion. The rest of it was unchanged. Which, again, that, to your point, has no bearing on the question at hand.
Well, except for the last point that he made, which I thought was also an interesting one, that a distinction between owner occupied and non-owner occupied could be fairly interpreted as a single family and non-single family. Again, I think that's a creative and interesting argument that I don't agree with, but it is a valid argument to the contrary.
Any other thoughts for discussion at the moment?
There is no way that this ends up a specific ruling. It would bear precedent on other things that are going on within this community. Correct?
It's not an area variance that just affects the one property. It's an interpretation that could in theory affect more and in practice probably would.
If we were gonna find in their favor, it would require us to adopt the view that who you rent your Airbnb to defines whether you're a single family use. And then everybody else who was renting on Airbnb in the past and is not a permitted use would be would then be arguing, well,
This.
we're also not a tourist home. You just established that renting on Airbnb means you're not a tourist home. And here are the reasons why we should always also be grandfathered. So it really is a matter of principle, whether this kind of thing qualifies as a tourist home or not. And that principle would affect every single, I don't know how many there are, if there's more than one, I don't know. But it would affect whatever people are in that same position.
Would also call into question something that I haven't in the 4 years that Corey's done his job, is that that's the one person who has integrity in this town above and beyond all, because he writes people up for fences. You know, your cupola is 3 inches too tall. You know, like it's insane the stuff that he picks up and he brings in front of us to make sure that people do it the right way. And that's something that's got me puzzled about all this, is because I don't think Corey typically does a poor job. He does too much of a job sometimes, but I don't think that that's a bad thing. I think that's indicative of the fact that we as a town have to embrace, we can't be Mayberry anymore. Pittsburgh's right there, Henrietta's right there, Russia's changing everything every day. You know, and Corey has to cross every T, dot every I. And typically he does.
Anything else?
No,
All right,
My suggestion is that, since a draft has been provided, additional additional discussion. That it sounds fairly clear that what the direction is. However, I think that, I would suggest perhaps tabling further discussion until the next meeting to allow us to fine tune the resolution that accurately reflects the comments made. And then at that meeting, you can further continue your discussion and also review the revised draft and make your decision at that meeting. That time. Stuff information and discussion. You're free to discuss it at the next meeting too as well.
that's something you could approach. Anyone see any objections to that? Then I believe a motion to table is in order.
On table.
Then
I'm sorry, was that next? Steve, was that you too?
I did not.
I was gonna move and then.
Okay, that's fine. Danny, you can move. A second.
Also,
All right, all those in favor of tabling this to the next meeting to discuss further?
aye.
All right, any opposed? Okay. Which concludes that for tonight.
Are you going to the 25th? You have something on the agenda.
Mhm.
Just to-
The Kings, the Queens, something like that. So we're already meeting 5:25. I will send some emails to David on things for a future revision. If you have any thoughts, by all means, bring them to the meeting and we'll, where we go then.
You're telling us not to send them.
I'm saying, let's not all have a group chat on email with all of us. That would be a bad thing.
Save that little.
If you want to talk to our legal counsel, I'm not going to stop you from doing that. That's between you and them. Does that sound good?
yes. Send your questions or comments to me.
So with that, unless anyone has anything else, motion to adjourn. All right, second. Okay, all those in favor?
Aye.
All right, well, that is the meeting.
Thank you very much.